Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to mastering complex topics for your competitive examinations and, well, your academic pursuits too. Have you ever stopped to truly consider the deep connection between forests and, the very fabric of our modern lives? Think about the paper in your textbooks, maybe the wood for your furniture, or even the spices in your food every day. Forests aren't just some distant green areas, they're foundational. They provide countless resources, essentials, industrial materials, everything. But what happens when these vast ecosystems and the communities living right there within them suddenly face enormous pressure from industrialization, from colonial control? Today, we're embarking on a crucial deep dive into forest
Yeah.
society and colonialism. It's a topic of immense importance, especially for those of you preparing for exams like UPSC, SSC, state PSCs, CDS, CAPF, and yes, your board exams too. Often, when we study the modern world, we tend to focus on factories, cities, big political changes, don't we? We frequently overlook the significant role, sometimes a devastating role, played by forest dwellers, by pastoralists. Their lives, sometimes maybe wrongly seen as stuck in the past, are actually integral to understanding how our contemporary world emerged. We're going to unpack how their worlds were reorganized quite dramatically and, importantly, how they resisted these changes, often against huge odds.
Indeed. And our focus today is to give you a really detailed historical context. We need to understand deforestation, not just that it happened, but why it accelerated so much during the colonial era. We'll look at the specific reasons, the ideologies behind it. We'll delve into these new forest management systems, the so-called scientific forestry. And critically, we have to analyze the consequences, the far-reaching, often devastating consequences for millions of people. We'll examine this in India, but also, very importantly, draw parallels with Indonesia. This helps highlight the global patterns you see, patterns of colonial exploitation, and also the resistance it sparked. This comparative view, it gives you a richer, more nuanced understanding, which is exactly what you need for tackling complex questions in your exams. It helps see the bigger picture, the legacy of colonialism on environment and society.
Okay, before we jump right into the colonial impact, which sounds quite profound, let's set the scene a bit. Can you help us understand the traditional relationship? How did communities interact with forests before colonialism? What was that like? And were there already changes happening that maybe paved the way for what came later?
Certainly. It's absolutely vital to grasp this pre-colonial baseline to understand just how drastic the colonial changes were. For centuries, communities living in or near forests had this, well, incredibly sustainable, almost symbiotic relationship with them. Their approach wasn't about just taking one thing, like timber. It was diverse. It was mixed use. Think of it like a natural supermarket, a pharmacy, a hardware store, all rolled into one. They collected a huge variety of products, roots, leaves, fruits, tubers. These weren't just occasional snacks. They were vital food sources, especially during monsoons. A real safety net. Herbs for medicine, based on generations of knowledge. Wood, yes, but for specific things like making plows, yokes, essential agricultural tools. Bamboo was incredibly versatile. Fences, baskets, mats, umbrellas, even musical instruments. Simple things, too, like dried gourds for water bottles. Leaves stitched together for plates and cups, especially for feasts. They used creepers like siati for strong ropes. The bark of the cedar tree is a grater. And something often overlooked, oil from the mahua fruit, for cooking, for lighting lamps. It shows a really deep, integrated reliance on the forest. It reflected a profound ecological understanding, living with the forest, not just extracting from it.
That paints such a different picture, doesn't it? So integrated, so diverse, a world away from just logging. Now, you mentioned deforestation isn't entirely new. Can you elaborate on those earlier changes before the British or Dutch arrived?
Yes, that's a key distinction. Deforestation, the clearing of forests, it did start centuries ago, long before the colonial period. The main drivers back then were simpler in a way, growing populations needing more food, so more land was cleared for cultivation. To give you a sense of scale, by around 1600, roughly 1/6 of India's landmass was already being cultivated, so clearing was happening. But, and this is the crucial point under colonial rule, this process just exploded. It became far more systematic, much more extensive, and it was driven by a completely different set of motives, not just local subsistence, but industrial-scale extraction for global markets. Look at the global figures. Between 1700 and 1995, the era of industrialization, something like 13.9 million square kilometers of forest vanished worldwide.
13.9 million. That's staggering.
It is. That's about 9.3% of the world's total area, cleared mainly for industrial use, commercial agriculture, pastures, massive amounts of fuel wood. This context helps us appreciate the sheer scale of the change we're discussing. Colonialism didn't invent deforestation, but it transformed its nature and accelerated its pace beyond anything seen before.
Right, that figure really drives home the scale. 9.3%, accelerated under colonialism. So let's drill down into that colonial period in India specifically. What were the main catalysts, the big drivers that led to this rapid, extensive deforestation? What was the thinking behind it?
Well, there were several powerful, interconnected drivers, all really stemming from the colonial administration's economic and strategic goals. What you see running through all of them, whether it's land for crops, wood for railways, or clearing for plantations, is this relentless focus on extraction and profit. They fundamentally saw forests not as ecosystems, not as homes for communities, but purely as resources, untapped resources for the empire. That's the core idea you need to grasp. So the first major driver was this view of forests as unproductive wilderness. That's a dangerous term, unproductive. Their main goal was to convert this wilderness into cultivated land. Why? To grow agricultural products for export, and crucially to generate more land revenue for the state coffers. This ideology that uncultivated land needed improvement through cultivation was very convenient. It sort of justified taking over land. There was this idea, if the original inhabitants didn't use the land in a way that generated revenue, well, then a great power, meaning the British, should take it and maximize its utility.
The justification for displacing people, essentially.
Precisely. And it led to a rapid expansion of farming land. Between 1880 and 1920 alone, cultivated land in India grew by 6.7 million hectares.
6.7 million hectares in just 40 years.
Yes, it's a huge area. And they weren't just expanding cultivation generally, they actively pushed for specific commercial crops. Things like jute, sugar, wheat, cotton. These were in massive demand in Europe. Growing cities needed food, industries needed raw materials like cotton for textiles. This expansion, presented as progress, meant clearing forests. And we have to remember, the land they called unproductive was often vital for forest dwellers, for nomadic pastoralists. Their entire way of life depended on these lands. The colonial view just ignored that reality completely.
It sounds like a complete transformation driven by economics. Beyond agriculture, the Industrial Revolution must have had a massive impact too. What about something like railways? How did they fuel deforestation?
Oh, absolutely. The second major driver was the railways. Their spread from the 1850s created this enormous, almost insatiable new demand for timber. Railways weren't just for trade, remember. They were vital for moving troops quickly, for maintaining control over India. Strategic infrastructure. Early locomotives needed wood for fuel, burning through logs rapidly. But even more significant was the need for sleepers.
Sleepers, those wooden planks under the track.
Exactly. Sturdy wooden planks laid across the track bed to hold the rails in place. Indispensable. And the numbers are just mind-boggling. Each mile of track needed between 1,760 and 2,000 sleepers. Imagine that scaled up across thousands of miles.
That's an incredible amount of wood per mile.
It is. And the network expanded incredibly fast. By 1890, about 25,500 kilometers of track laid. By 1946, it was over 765,000 kilometers. This meant millions and millions of trees were felled. Just to give you an example, in the Madras presidency alone, back in the 1850s, they were cutting 35,000 trees every year just for sleepers. The government gave contracts to supply this timber. But these contractors often worked with little oversight. They cut indiscriminately, clearing whole patches of forest. This led to forests vanishing rapidly, especially around the railway lines. It shows the intense, relentless pressure driven by this infrastructure project.
Genuinely shocking numbers. The scale is hard to comprehend. And I think there was a third major factor. You mentioned plantations.
Yes, the third major driver was establishing large-scale plantations. Huge areas of natural forests were cleared systematically, cleared to make way for tea, coffee, rubber. These were highly profitable commodities in massive demand back in Europe.
So replacing natural forests with cash crops.
Precisely. The colonial government made this happen. They acquired vast forest lands, often very cheaply, sometimes through dubious means, and handed them over to European planters. These areas were then enclosed, fenced off. The natural, diverse forest cover was completely removed, and then they planted a single-crop monoculture. Tea bushes in neat rows, rubber trees. This completely changed the local ecology, destroyed biodiversity, and it totally disrupted the traditional ways people used the land. It's another clear example of prioritizing export earnings over everything else.
Okay, so we have this massive filling for agriculture, railways, plantations. At some point, surely, the British must have gotten worried about running out of trees, even from their own perspective. How did they try to manage this? To control the forests? This is where scientific forestry comes in, isn't it?
Exactly. They did get concerned. Not primarily out of ecological concern, as we did understand it today, mind you. Their worry was that uncontrolled cutting by locals and indiscriminate felling by traders would destroy the timber resource, the resource they needed for ships, railways, revenue. So this pragmatic worry led them to introduce a new system, a highly controlled, centralized system they called commercial forestry, or perhaps misleadingly, scientific forestry.
Misleadingly. Why
Yeah.
misleadingly?
Well, because it wasn't scientific in the sense of understanding or preserving ecosystems. It was a science of timber extraction, how to get the maximum sustained yield of commercially valuable wood. To set this up, they brought in an expert, a German named Dietrich Brandes. He became the first Inspector General of Forests in India in 1864, a key figure. Brandes argued for a proper system, for training people in this science of conservation, again, meaning conservation of timber. He believed this needed legal backing. Rules had to be framed, enforced. Felling, grazing, all had to be restricted to protect the timber. He even said anyone cutting trees outside the system should be punished severely. To make this happen, Brandes was instrumental in setting up the Indian Forest Service in 1864, and he helped draft the first Indian Forest Act in 1865. Later, the Imperial Forest Research Institute was established in Dehradun in 1906. This became the main training ground for forest officials in this specific type of forestry.
So scientific forestry was really about industrial timber production, treating forests like farms. What did it actually look like on the ground, and how did the Forest Act formalize it?
Precisely. It was an industrial model applied to forests. What they taught in Dehradun, what was implemented across India, it was quite drastic. Natural forests, with all their different species, ages, sizes, were often clear-felled, just cut down completely. And in their place, monoculture plantations. One type of tree, usually teak or sal, planted in straight rows, like crops in a field. Uniformity was the goal. Forest officials would survey the forests, estimate the timber volume, and create these detailed working plans. These plans dictated exactly how much of the plantation to cut each year on a strict rotation. Then replant, supposedly for the next cycle years later, it turned forests into timber factories.
And the Forest Act, how did that lock this system in place?
The Forest Act, especially after amendments in 1878 and 1927, gave the state immense power. The 1878 Act was particularly crucial. It divided forests into three categories: reserved, protected, and village forests. Reserved forests were considered the best, the most valuable timber areas, and they were made completely off-limits to villagers. No gathering wood, fruit, leaves, nothing.
Yeah.
Strict prohibition.
Completely off limits, even for their own basic needs.
Completely. Then you had protected forests. Here, some traditional rights like grazing or collecting wood might be allowed, but under heavy restrictions. People needed permits, which were often hard to get. And finally, village forests, usually smaller, less valuable areas. Villagers could take wood for house building or fuel from here, but often these were inadequate or far away. This classification basically ensured the state controlled the best timber resources, directly at the expense of local communities' livelihoods.
That's a staggering change from the traditional ways you described earlier, a complete redefinition of people's relationship with their environment imposed from outside. How did these new rules, the scientific forestry, the Forest Acts, how did they actually impact the daily lives of millions of forest dwellers? What was the human cost?
The impact was profound, deeply disruptive, and almost entirely negative for local communities. It severed that age-old connection. One immediate problem was this fundamental clash over what a good forest even was. For villagers, a good forest was diverse. It provided fuel, fodder for cattle, leaves, medicines, food, a whole range of things for daily life. A mixed forest was a useful forest. But the forest department, they wanted tall, straight hardwood trees. Teak, sal. Good for ships, good for railways. Their definition was purely commercial. So this led them to actively promote teak and sal and clear out all the other species that villagers actually relied on. What was useless to the department was often essential for the locals.
So they were actively destroying the resources people needed.
Effectively, yes. And worse, the Forest Act criminalized so many everyday activities. Things people had done for generations became illegal overnight. Cutting wood for your own house.
Illegal.
Raising your cattle.
Yeah.
Illegal. Collecting fruits. Roots. Illegal. Hunting. Fishing for your family. Illegal.
Everything became illegal.
Pretty much anything that involved taking something from the reserved or even protected forests without permission, which was impossible for most people to get or afford. This forced people into a terrible position. They had to steal from their own ancestral forests just to survive. And if they were caught, they were vulnerable to harassment, bribery by forest guards. Women, who often collected fuel wood, were particularly affected, facing constant threats. There were also widespread reports of police and forest guards demanding free food, free labor. It just added to the hardship and created immense resentment.
A truly devastating situation, turning subsistence into crime. You mentioned shifting cultivation specifically earlier. That must have been a major point of conflict. What happened when they banned that?
Yes, the ban on shifting cultivation, or shum or podu or whatever the local name was one of the most damaging impacts. It struck at the heart of many communities' way of life. Shifting cultivation, remember, was this traditional farming method used across Asia, Africa, South America. Cut, burn, sow in the ashes, harvest, then leave fallow for many years for the forest to recover.
Right, a rotational system.
Exactly, often growing a mix of crops, providing food security. It was a sophisticated system adapted to specific environments. But European foresters saw it as destructive. Why? Because land cultivated every few years couldn't grow the big, straight timber trees they wanted. It interfered with their timber production plans. They also worried about fires spreading from the burning plots and damaging valuable timber nearby. And administratively, it was a nightmare for them. How do you calculate fixed taxes on land that shifts every few years? It didn't fit their neat bureaucratic model.
So it was inconvenient for timber and taxes.
Basically, yes. And so the government banned it. The consequences were dire. Countless communities were forcibly displaced from their homes in the forests. Many had to completely change their occupation, often becoming landless laborers. Others resisted, leading to numerous uprisings, both small and large.
So it wasn't just about timber, it was also about imposing a fixed taxable system. And this control extended to hunting too, didn't it? You mentioned that earlier.
Absolutely. The forest laws completely changed hunting practices as well. Before these laws, hunting deer, partridges, small animals was a crucial part of survival for many forest communities. It was a customary right, part of their subsistence. Suddenly, this was prohibited. If caught hunting, they were punished for poaching, again criminalizing survival.
But didn't the British themselves hunt?
Ah, yes. That's the stark contrast. While local subsistence hunting was banned, hunting big game became a prestigious sport, especially for British officials and Indian royalty who copied them. The British had this idea that large animals, tigers, leopards, wolves, represented a wild, savage India. Killing them was seen as civilizing the country, asserting dominance over nature. They even offered rewards for killing these animals, claiming they were a threat to cultivators. This led to an absolutely shocking level of slaughter. Between 1875 and 1925, records show over 80,000 tigers, 150,000 leopards, and 200,000 wolves were killed for rewards alone.
80,000 tigers. That's unbelievable.
It is. The tiger became a sporting trophy. There are stories of individuals like the Maharaja of Sarguja shooting over 1,000 tigers. A British administrator, George Ewell, killed 400. Initially, some forests were even reserved just for hunting by the elite. It was only much later, when environmental awareness grew and species were clearly endangered, that conservationists started pushing to protect these animals, a complete reversal. This difference, banning local hunting for food while promoting large-scale sport hunting, really highlights the hypocrisy and the biases of the colonial system.
A very powerful contrast indeed. Now, amidst all this hardship and restriction, did these massive changes create any new kinds of work or opportunities, even if they were exploitative?
That's a complex point. Yes, while many lost their livelihoods, the new system did create some new, often exploitative economic roles, particularly in trade and labor. Some communities, unable to continue their traditional ways, shifted into trading forest products. This wasn't entirely new. Trade had always existed. Think of the Munduruku people in the Amazon, shifting from farming to collecting rubber for traders. In India, too, communities like the Banjaras had long traded forest goods. But under the British, this trade became completely regulated, monopolized. Large European firms were often given exclusive rights to trade in specific forest products in certain areas. This, combined with the bans on grazing and hunting, hit many nomadic and pastoralist communities very hard. Groups like the Karava, Karacha, Urukula, and Madras Presidency lost their traditional livelihoods. And some of these communities faced an even worse fate. They were labeled criminal tribes under a specific act in 1871.
Criminal tribes, what did that mean?
It meant they were stigmatized, constantly supervised, restricted in their movements, and often forced into working in factories, mines, or plantations under government watch. Basically a source of cheap, controlled labor. So these new opportunities you asked about, they often didn't mean improvement. Look at Assam, for example. Men and women from forest communities, Santals, Oriens from Jharkhand, Gons from Chhattisgarh were recruited, often tricked or coerced to work on tea plantations. The wages were terrible, conditions harsh, hours long, and it was incredibly difficult for them to ever return home. They were trapped by debt, by contracts. It shows how the colonial economy often just replaced traditional subsistence with new forms of exploitation and bondage. Free communities turned into sources of forced labor for the empire.
It's crystal clear that these laws and the exploitation caused immense resentment, immense hardship. It seems almost inevitable that people would resist. Were there major organized resistances against these forest policies in India? Can you give us a specific example to understand this better?
Absolutely. Resistance was widespread. Forest communities across India and globally consistently pushed back against these changes. We remember figures like Birsa Munda and Chotanagpur, Sidhu and Kanu leading the Santhal Rebellion, Alluri Sitaramuraju in Andhra Pradesh. Their stories are still told. They're remembered as heroes who fought the British. But for a detailed case study today, let's focus on a very significant rebellion in the Kingdom of Bastar in 1910. It really encapsulates many of these issues.
MS, that's in present-day Chhattisgarh, right?
Yes, the southernmost part of Chhattisgarh borders Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, Maharashtra. Geographically diverse, a central plateau, plains to the north and south, the Indravati River flowing through it. It's home to many different communities, Maria and Miria Gons, Turwas, Bathras, Halbas. They speak different languages but share common customs, common beliefs, especially about land and nature. These communities had, and many still have, a deep reverence for the earth, for the spirits of the river, forest, mountain, a very spiritual connection. Traditionally, each village knew its boundaries, and importantly, they managed the resources within those boundaries collectively, a form of communal governance. They even had systems for sharing. If one village needed wood from another's forest, they paid a small fee to sari, dand, or man. It showed mutual respect, regulated use. Some villages hired watchmen, paid collectively in grain to protect their forests. And they had gatherings, like an annual hunt, where headmen from different villages in a cluster, a pargana, would meet to discuss issues, including forest management, collective decision-making.
So a strong existing system of community governance and resource management. What specifically pushed them to rebel in 1910? What was the final straw?
It was a culmination of things, but the immediate trigger was a colonial government proposal in 1905. They proposed to reserve two-thirds of the Bastar forest. Two-thirds.
Two-thirds. That's huge.
Massive. And reservation meant banning shifting cultivation, banning hunting, banning collection of forest produce, all the things essential for their survival. This caused deep anxiety. Now, some villages were technically allowed to stay within the reserve forests, but there was a catch. They had to provide free labor regard to the forest department, cutting trees, hauling timber, building roads, fighting fires, all unpaid. These became known as forest villages.
So basically forced labor camps.
In effect, yes. Meanwhile, people in other villages were just evicted. Forcibly displaced, no notice, no compensation, just thrown off their ancestral lands. All this came on top of existing problems, rising land rents, constant demands for free labor and supplies from officials. It was already unbearable. Then came two devastating famines in 1899, 1900, and 1907, 1908. People were starving. The Forest Reservation Plan was the absolute final straw. Rebellion seemed the only option left.
A real convergence of factors leading to an explosion. How did the uprising actually unfold? How did they organize?
People started discussing these issues everywhere in village councils, at markets, during festivals. The initiative really came from the Durwas community in the Kangar Forest, where reservations started first. They were hit hardest initially. There wasn't one single leader, like a king. But Gundadur from Nethanar village is widely remembered as a key figure, an important organizer. In 1910, traditional signals started circulating. Mango boughs, lumps of earth, chilies, arrows. These were messages passed from village to village, urging people to join the rebellion. A very effective traditional communication network.
Symbolic messages.
Yes, and every village contributed something towards the expenses of the rebellion. It showed collective action. The uprising itself involved widespread action. Bazaars were looted. Houses of officials, traders, schools, police stations, symbols of colonial power were burned and robbed. Grain was seized and redistributed. The targets were very specific, those associated with the colonial state and its oppressive laws. Forest officials, police, merchants who profited. It was clearly directed anger. A missionary at the time, William Ward, described people linked to the colonial state police, merchants, forest peons, teachers streaming into the main town, Jagdalpur fleeing the rebellion.
It sounds remarkably coordinated despite the lack of a single leader. How did the British handle such widespread resistance, and what was the outcome for the Bastar people?
The British responded with force, predictably. Troops were sent in. Adivasi leaders tried to negotiate. They sent messengers, but the British weren't interested. They surrounded the rebel camps and opened fire. Then the troops marched through the villages. There was flogging, punishments for anyone suspected of participating. Many people fled deep into the jungles to escape the repression. It took the British about 3 months, from February to May 1910, to regain control, which shows how determined the resistance was. And significantly, Gundadur was never captured. He remained a symbol of defiance.
So did the rebellion achieve anything?
Yes, it did. It was a major, though partial, victory. The British were shaken. They temporarily suspended the work on reservation. And crucially, the area planned for reservation was reduced to about half of what was originally intended before 1910.
So resistance did force a change.
It did. It showed that collective action could make the colonial state reconsider, even if partially. But it's important for you, our learners, to note the struggle didn't end with independence. Even after 1947, governments continued policies excluding people from forests for industrial projects. For instance, in the 1970s, there was a World Bank project planned for Basra itself, replacing natural salt forests with pine for the paper industry. That was only stopped because of protests by local environmentalists and Adivasi communities. So these conflicts over forest resources and rights are ongoing, even today.
That Bastar example is incredibly powerful. It really highlights the dynamics of colonial forestry and local resistance in India, where similar things happening elsewhere under different colonial powers.
Let's shift focus now to Java in Indonesia under the Dutch. Was it a similar story? Yes, the parallels are quite striking. It makes for a very useful comparison, especially for understanding broader colonial patterns. Java, famous now for rice cultivation, was once heavily forested, especially with valuable teak, and the Dutch, the colonial power there, implemented forest policies remarkably similar to the British in India. Like the British, the Dutch needed timber, primarily for shipbuilding to support their massive trade empire. By 1600, Java already had a large population, around 3.4 million, and many communities practiced shifting cultivation, especially in the hills, just like in India.
And were there specific communities central to forestry there, like the forest dwellers in India?
Yes, a key group in Java was the Kalangs. They were known as highly skilled forest cutters and also practiced shifting cultivation. Their expertise was vital. So vital, in fact, that when the main Javanese kingdom, Mataram, split in 1755, the 6,000 Kalang families were literally divided equally between the two new kingdoms. That shows how indispensable they were for timber harvesting and building palaces.
Wow, they were treated almost like a strategic resource themselves.
Exactly. So when the Dutch started tightening their control over forests in the 18th century, they tried to bring the Kalangs under their direct authority to control their skills in the timber. And predictably, this led to resistance. In 1770, for example, the Kalangs attacked a Dutch fort at Joanna. Though that uprising was suppressed, it was an early sign of the conflict to come.
Okay, so the pattern holds. Colonial power wants timber, targets skilled communities, faces resistance. How did Dutch scientific forestry develop in Java? Was it the same as the British model?
Very similar principles, yes. In the 19th century, as the Dutch consolidated control over territory, not just people, they enacted strict forest laws in Java. These laws heavily restricted villagers' access. Wood could only be cut for specific purposes, like building boats or houses, and only from certain forests under close supervision. Permits were needed, fees were charged, grazing cattle in young forests was punished. Transporting wood without a permit was illegal. Even just using forest roads with carts or cattle was restricted. Small things, but they hugely impacted daily life.
And the driver was timber demand again.
Yes, just like in India, shipbuilding and railways. By 1882, Java alone was exporting 280,000 sleepers annually, a huge number. And to get the labor for all this cutting, transporting, preparing timber, the Dutch used similar tactics to the British. First, they imposed rents on land villagers cultivated inside the forest. Then they introduced a system called Blandondansten.
Blandondansten? What was that?
It was basically forced labor.
Wow.
Some villages were exempted from paying rent if they provided free labor and buffaloes for logging operations. Very similar to Bihar in India. Later, they shifted to paying very small wages, but still restricted or denied the villagers' rights to cultivate forest land for their own subsistence. It ensured a cheap, captive workforce.
So forced labor was key in both systems. Were there different kinds of resistance in Java, maybe less violent forms?
Yes, absolutely. Around 1890, a very interesting and influential movement emerged, led by a man named Sarantiko Samin from Radoblotung village, right in a teak forest area. Samin challenged the Dutch on a philosophical level. He questioned the very idea that the state could own the forest.
How did he argue that?
His argument was simple, but profound. The state didn't create the wind, water, earth, or wood. So how could it own them? Nature belonged to everyone, or to God. This idea really resonated. His sons-in-law helped organize the movement, spreading his ideas. By 1907, about 3,000 families had joined the Salmonist movement.
3,000 families, that's significant. How do they protest?
Their methods were mainly non-violent forms of non-cooperation. When Dutch officials came to survey their land, Salmonists would just lie down on it, a passive but powerful protest. Others simply refused to pay taxes or fines. They refused to perform the forced labor demanded under Blandingdiensten. This intellectual and practical challenge to the legitimacy of colonial ownership is a fascinating aspect of Javanese resistance. It was harder for the Dutch to counter than armed rebellion, perhaps, because it attacked the foundation of their authority.
It's clear the colonial era left a deep, often damaging mark on forests and forest communities in both India and Java. Did bigger global events, like the World Wars, affect things even more? And importantly, have we learned anything since then? Have approaches to forest management changed?
The World Wars certainly had a huge, devastating impact. Any pretense of sustainable management just went out the window during wartime. In India, during both World Wars, the Forest Department basically abandoned its working plans and cut timber freely to meet British war needs. Military infrastructure, supplies the demand was enormous. In Java, the situation was complex. Just before the Japanese occupied during WWII, the Dutch carried out a scorched earth policy. They destroyed sawmills, burnt massive stockpiles of teak logs to prevent them falling into Japanese hands. Huge environmental damage.
Scorched earth, destroying their own resources.
To deny them to the enemy, yes. Then the Japanese, during their occupation, exploited the forest recklessly for their own war machine, forcing villagers to cut timber. But there's a paradox here. During the chaos of war with colonial control weakened, many villagers in both India and Java actually used the opportunity to expand their cultivation into forest areas.
So they reclaimed land while the colonial powers were distracted.
Exactly. It was a chance to secure their own food supply in difficult times. But after the war, when the colonial powers, or newly independent states, tried to reassert control, it was very difficult to get that land back from the communities. This really highlights that ongoing tension, doesn't it? People's need for land versus the state's desire to control forests, often for commercial purchases. The wars just intensified this existing conflict.
A fascinating consequence. So post-colonial era, especially more recently, say since the 1980s, has there been a real shift away from that old colonial scientific forestry model?
Yes, thankfully there's been a significant shift in thinking, though perhaps slower than ideal. Governments across Asia and Africa started realizing something important. They saw that the old system, rigid scientific forestry, excluding local communities, it just led to conflict, constant conflict. And often it wasn't even effective for conservation. Monoculture plantations aren't healthy ecosystems.
Right, they're not diverse or resilient.
Exactly. So the focus began to shift, away from just timber extraction towards broader conservation goals, biodiversity, ecosystem health, water resources, and a crucial realization dawned. You can't achieve real conservation without involving the people who live in and around the forests. Their participation is essential.
So involving local communities, recognizing their knowledge.
Precisely. Their traditional knowledge, once dismissed, is now increasingly seen as valuable. Look at India in many areas. From Mizoram to Kerala, dense forests have survived because local villages protected them as sacred groves. Sarnas, Divarakudu, Kent, or different names, same idea.
Protected through local tradition, not just government rules.
Yes, through deep cultural and spiritual connections. And some villages have even taken patrols into their own hands, rotating the duty among households, rather than relying only on forest guards. This reflects a move towards more collaborative approaches. Things like joint forest management try to create partnerships between the state and local communities. It's about recognizing that local people are often the best guardians of their own environment. A fundamental shift away from that top-down exclusionary colonial model. Hashtag outro.
Wow, that was a truly extensive and, I think, very insightful deep dive into a complex history. Forest societies, colonialism, the reshaping of landscapes and lives. We've seen immense hardship, but also incredible resilience and resistance.
Indeed. And understanding these historical patterns, these causes and consequences, is absolutely crucial for you as competitive exam aspirants. It helps you grasp the roots of so many contemporary issues, land conflicts, resource rights, the arguments around sustainable development, the need for community involvement in conservation. This history isn't just history, it informs the present.
It certainly leaves us with a key question to think about, doesn't it? A question for you, our learner, to consider further. How can that invaluable traditional indigenous knowledge and the success stories of community-led conservation, how can they genuinely inform and improve modern forest management, not just in India, but globally? How do we truly move beyond that colonial legacy?
That's a very pertinent point for your own reflection and further research. It points toward finding genuinely sustainable and equitable solutions for the future.
We really hope this deep dive has given you valuable insights and a much clearer understanding of this critical topic for your exams and for your broader awareness. Stay tuned for more exam-ready insights. Follow us for more such content. In this deep dive, we covered the following topics: the pre-colonial forests and initial transformations, major drivers of colonial deforestation in India, the rise of commercial forestry and its principles, profound impacts of forest laws on people's lives, forest rebellions, the case of Bastard, India, forest rebellions, forest transformations in Java, Indonesia, a comparative study, forest rebellions, broader impacts and modern perspectives,